Hi, everyone. Today we're going to talk about slavery in Southern society during the antebellum period, or the era leading up to the Civil War. Between 1800 and 1860, the South became the driving engine for the market revolution that was transforming America's economy. The cotton gin, invented by Eli Whitney in 1793, made the large scale production of cotton possible, and there was an explosion of cotton cultivation in the Deep South. Cotton became the single most important crop to the South. And while the cotton gin made it easier to separate the cotton fiber from the seeds, the actual planting and growing of the cotton remained a very labor intensive task that demanded a large number of workers. As the South's prosperity became tied to cotton production, the South increasingly filled their labor shortages with slaves. The growth of slavery would directly correlate with the growth of cotton production in the South. By 1840, cotton made up half of the value of all American exports, and the South was responsible for more than half of the world's cotton supply, making it one of the most important American commodities prior to the Civil War. It is because of this value to the American economy that many people declared that cotton is king. Unfortunately, during the same time period, the number of slaves in the South would expand from about 700,000 people in 1790 to almost 4 million people by 1860, the year before the start of the Civil War. Now, those 4 million slaves made up about 40% of the total population of the South. In some states, such as South Carolina, the number of slaves would actually outnumber those who were considered to be free whites. Thus, slavery was a very large part of Southern society, and it is impossible to separate the prosperity of the Cotton Kingdom from the enslaved workers who created it and maintained it. However, it is important to note that it wasn't just Southern society that benefited from King Cotton and the slave labor used to cultivate it. The Northern economy was highly dependent on cotton as well. The northern mills and factories that were being built in places like Lowell, Massachusetts, relied on the cotton from the South to produce their textiles. Northern merchants profited from shipping Southern cotton to places like England and other countries around the world. And even Northern insurance companies made money by insuring the lives of slaves used to labor in the South. The grim reality was that all regions of the country were prospering in the antebellum period largely due to King Cotton and the slave labor used to produce it. And so when we think of slavery and its dark legacy on U.S. history, we need to understand that this was not just a Southern institution, but an institution that connected to all parts of America prior to the Civil War. So I want to begin by talking about Southern society during this time period, because they're the ones that were shaped most directly by the growth of cotton and slavery. During the antebellum period, the South developed into a society that was incredibly hierarchical. At the top of Southern society were the families of the largest plantations. This planter aristocracy consisted of about 1,700 families who controlled most of the cotton production, owned most of the slaves, and controlled not only most of the wealth of the South, but also its political power. Their vast plantations, many in excess of over 2,000 acres, afforded the planter aristocracy many advantages in Southern society, including access to private tutors and the elite educational institutions of the day, which included Yale and West Point. But their wealth also provided plantation owners with the time and opportunity to enter politics. Both John C. Calhoun and Jefferson Davis, the first and only president of the Confederate States of America, owned plantations of more than 600 acres. So these planter elites owned 100 or more slaves apiece. And when we think of the South during this time period, this is often the image that comes to mind, that of the large plantation with the tall column plantation mansion. However, this is not an accurate portrayal of most of Southerners in the early 1800s. Most slave owners own on average 5 slaves or less, and a majority of Southerners own no slaves at all. In fact, about 75% of the Southern population own no slaves. Most of these Southerners were small subsistence farmers who grew only enough to support their family, or landless whites who were often looked down upon by the elite planter class as poor white trash. Yet despite the fact that a majority of whites did not own slaves, we see an enormous amount of support for the institution of slavery among whites of all social classes. Which begs the question, why would people who don't own slaves and don't benefit from slavery economically support this system in the years leading up to the Civil War? There are 2 major reasons for this. First of all, slavery in the South during this time period was connected to social mobility and a twisted take on the American dream. So the average price of a slave in 1860 was roughly $1,850, or about $60,000 in today's money. That was way too expensive for most Southerners. However, that didn't stop Southerners from dreaming of one day owning slaves and using their labor to become wealthy. The second reason deals with the inherent racism embedded in the institution of slavery itself. Many Southerners took pride in their supposed racial superiority, which was created by the existence of slavery. The poorest whites in the South supported the system of slavery because it meant that they were not on the bottom of society. For these poor whites, supporting slavery and the racist ideas that it promoted made them feel like they were of a higher social status. So this takes us to the conditions of slaves in the South prior to the Civil War. It is important to note that the experiences of slaves could vary dramatically from one owner to another, and depending on the size of the farm that slaves were being forced to work on. For example, on small farms where there were less than 5 slaves, often the master and the slaves would work side by side cultivating crops. This was dramatically different from the experiences of those on large plantations with over 100 slaves. That being said, there were some universal features of the form of slavery that was created in the antebellum South, regardless of where the slave worked. So first, all slaves were legally considered property. As property, they had no legal protections within the American justice system, and they had no rights which protected them from unfair treatment. Slaves' status as property was especially significant because the Southern system of slavery was designed to dehumanize slaves, and it paved the way for the cruel conditions slaves faced, including violent treatment. So second, as noted earlier, antebellum slavery had a racial basis. The entire system was based on the idea of white superiority, and racist views would continually be used to justify slavery's existence. So, for example, in the 1830s, John C. Calhoun would defend slavery by calling it a positive good. He argued that slave owners cared for their slaves the way that parents care for their children. This concept of paternalism assumed that whites were superior and that slaves were not capable of caring for themselves in American society, an idea that was undermined by the presence of 500,000 free blacks living in the North and the South prior to the Civil War. These beliefs in white superiority were prevalent throughout all parts of American society, including the North, and it binded both slave owners and non-slave owners together in their support for this peculiar institution, as slavery came to be called. So finally, it is important to note that the status of slaves as property was always enforced by the use or threat of violence. The threat of violence and the use of torture was always a reality that underpinned every master and slave relationship. Even in the best master and slave relationships, the use of violence remained a real and horrifying possibility. So even though most Southerners did not own slaves, a majority of slaves were controlled by the wealthiest planter class. Therefore, let's take a look at what plantation slavery looked like in America during this time period. So between 1800 and 1860, a majority of slaves became concentrated in the Deep South in an area that became known as the Black Belt. And this Black Belt stretched from South Carolina to Louisiana across the Deep South. In the colonial era, slaves had arrived in America via the Middle Passage. However, the slave trade was outlawed in 1807 by Congress, and so a new internal slave trade emerged within the United States, which was designed to sell slaves to the Deep South so that they could help with the cultivation of cotton. This internal slave trade became known as the Second Middle Passage. And between 1820 and 1860, over 800,000 slaves were sold down the river from old tobacco plantations in Virginia and North Carolina to areas in the Deep South. Places like New Orleans emerged as markets for the internal slave trade, and slave auctions became commonplace in many parts of the South. Slave auctions were one of the most dreaded moments in the life of a slave and was an incredibly humiliating and dehumanizing experience. Slaves on the auction block were forced to strip for potential buyers. There, in front of everyone, they were examined like livestock. Families were often separated by these slave auctions. In fact, the most conservative estimates indicate that at least 10 to 20% of slave marriages were destroyed by sale. The sale of children from parents was even more common. Over the course of a 35-year lifetime, a slave had about a 50-50 chance of being sold at least once and was likely to witness the sale of several members of his or her immediate family. Now, the central condition for all plantation slaves was work. While slaves held all types of jobs on the plantation, from domestic workers who maintained the plantation home to slaves who possessed trade skills such as carpenters and blacksmiths, an overwhelming number of slaves worked in the fields, cultivating and picking cotton. Slavery along the coast had been based on a task system in which slaves in Virginia and Maryland were given a precise work objective to complete each day. Once slaves completed these tasks, they were free to complete their own work and spent time chopping wood, planting gardens, and caring for their children. However, antebellum slavery in the Deep South was designed to extract as much work out of each slave as possible in order to turn large profits. Slaves were expected to work from dawn till dusk in the fields, and at times they would work even longer if the moonlight allowed. Despite an absence of new technology, cotton picking per person increased in the antebellum period at a rate of about 2.6% per year, due to what planters called the pushing system, or what some historians have called the whipping machine system. Now, in the pushing system, masters used violence and torture to force slaves to constantly work harder and faster. This is probably best illustrated by cotton weigh-ins that occurred each day during harvest time. Every day, the amount of cotton that was picked by a slave was weighed and recorded by the master. These weigh-ins put slaves in a lose-lose situation. If slaves picked less than the previous day, they would be whipped for failing to meet their quota. However, if they picked more, the slave master would record the new higher number as their quota moving forward. Thus, the pushing system was always using violence to extract more labor from those who were enslaved. So the living conditions on most plantations were very, very poor. Chickens, dogs, and pigs lived next to the slave quarters, and in consequence, animal feces contaminated the entire area. Squalid living conditions and poor housing aggravated health problems for many slaves. Half of all slave infants died during the first year of life, twice the rate of white babies. And while the death rate declined for those who survived their first year, it remained twice the rate of whites through age 14. As a result of this high infant and childhood death rate, the average life expectancy of a slave was just 22 years of age, compared to 43 years for antebellum whites. Now, slavery put a great deal of pressure on the family structure as well. Slave marriages and family ties were not recognized by American law. Any owner was free to sell husbands from wives, parents from children, and brothers from sisters. In many cases, slave spouses lived apart. Many large slaveholders had numerous plantations and frequently shifted slaves, splitting families in the process. Another terrible threat to the slave family was the possibility of sexual assault of slave women. Some masters, like James Hammond, a congressman, governor, and U.S. senator from South Carolina, took slave mistresses. Hammond, whose wife bore him 8 children, purchased an 18-year-old slave named Sally and her infant daughter, Louisa, in 1839. He made Sally his mistress and fathered several children by her. And then when the daughter reached the age of 12, fathered several children by her. Now, unfortunately, this was not an isolated incident. A survey of former slaves conducted in 1930 revealed that about 4.5% said that one of their parents had been white. Under the institution of slavery, the children of the master and their slaves would then be born into slavery and essentially became the property of their own father. Now, despite these horrific challenges, slaves did their best to create stable family lives. Many slaves in the South managed to marry and raise their children in a 2-parent household, though it is telling that slave marriage vows often proclaimed, "Until death or distance do you part." Now, many slaves turned to religion and other cultural outlets in order to cope with the conditions of slavery. During the Second Great Awakening, many slaves were converted to Christianity by evangelical preachers. Slaves tended to be attracted to the parts of the Bible that were the most relevant to their own situation. They were especially drawn to the book of Exodus, which told the story of Moses leading the Israelites out of slavery in Egypt. It's no coincidence that Harriet Tubman, a conductor on the Underground Railroad, was nicknamed Moses by those who knew her. So it is important to recognize that slaves did not willingly accept their conditions of bondage. And there were, in fact, a great deal of resistance that occurred within the system of slavery. Day to day resistance was the most common form of opposition to slavery. Breaking tools, feigning illness, staging slowdowns, and committing acts of arson and sabotage were all forms of resistance and expressions of slaves' alienation from their masters. Others, like Frederick Douglass, taught themselves to read and write in direct violation of Southern laws at the time. Universally, slaves yearned for their freedom, and some slaves took more drastic action by running away from the plantation. By 1850, there was on average roughly 1,000 slaves who successfully ran away each year, and many more who tried but failed. Perhaps the most extreme resistance came in the form of slave rebellion. Though rare, there were several notable slave rebellions which occurred during the antebellum period. For example, in 1800, there was an armed slave rebellion known as Gabriel's Rebellion that took place in Richmond, Virginia. The slave revolt was foiled by informers before it began, and the leaders of the insurrection were hung. In 1822, Denmark Vesey, a free black in South Carolina, was accused of trying to incite a slave rebellion in Charleston. Vesey was found guilty and he was publicly executed. Perhaps the most famous slave revolt was Nat Turner's Rebellion, an uprising of slaves in Southampton, Virginia, that led to the death of 60 white Virginians. Nat Turner and his followers were all caught and either executed or sold to areas outside of Virginia. So I hope you take away from today's lecture that first, the American economy was built at least partially on the backs of millions of enslaved men, women, and children laboring in the South. We tend to see slavery as something that only impacted the Southern economy, but in reality, the American Revolution meant that people all over the country, even in the North, profited from enslaved labor. We need to acknowledge that so much of America's expansion during the early 1800s was tied to the labor produced by slaves. And for that reason, the United States owes a debt to slaves that it cannot and will not ever be able to repay. Secondly, however, as bad as you think slavery was, it was almost certainly much, much worse. It is impossible for us to truly imagine the conditions under which most slaves lived during the antebellum period. Slavery was an abomination and a great stain on the history of the United States, something that Abraham Lincoln himself acknowledged during his second inaugural address, which he gave in 1865 towards the end of the Civil War. In that speech, Lincoln wondered whether the Civil War, with its cost of hundreds of thousands of lives, was the price that America had to pay for its failure to dissolve slavery. The Civil War was undoubtedly the product of slavery, which we will see in future chapters. But we need to recognize that the legacy of slavery extends far beyond the final shots fired between the Union and the Confederacy, a legacy of racism and inequality that we are still dealing with today.